Welcome to one of the most unsettling journeys we've ever brought to you on this channel. There's a type of story that doesn't appear in school textbooks, not because it's less important, but because it's too dark, too unsettling, and carries a weight that official history prefers to leave buried in the mountains where it all happened. It's the kind of story that survives in a different way, not on printed pages, not in official records, but in porch conversations, in hushed voices, in glances exchanged between older people when the subject is unintentionally brought up. And it's precisely this kind of story that we're here to tell. Before we begin, if you enjoy this type of content and want to support the channel, the link to my ebook is in the description and in the pinned comment. Your support is what keeps this type of content alive here. Today, we're going to talk about Elias Mercer, a name that, depending on where you grew up in Appalachia, might send shivers down your spine in casual conversation, or simply be whispered with that strange mix of respect and terror that only the deep interior of the United States knows how to produce. 52 years of life, each one marked by a hardship that went far beyond working in the mines, beyond poverty, beyond everything we usually call just a hard life. To understand Elias Mercer, we first need to understand the place where he existed. The Appalachians are not just a mountain range, they are a world apart. A long, rugged strip that cuts across the eastern United States from north to south, passing through states like Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. To outsiders, the mountains are beautiful, shrouded in morning mist, covered in dense oak and pine forests, and crisscrossed by rivers of cold, translucent water. But to those who live there, the mountains have a different meaning. They isolate. They hold secrets. And in the 19th century, when coal began to be extracted from the bowels of those hills, they began to swallow whole men, not only because of the harshness of the work in the mines, but because of the kind of existence that life forged in each person. Coal mining in the Appalachians was brutal in a way we can hardly imagine today. Men descended into the pits before dawn and climbed back up long after sunset. They worked bent over, breathing coal dust with lamps on their heads and pickaxes in hand, in tunnels that were sometimes less than 5 feet high. Their bodies were permanently scarred, deformed joints, blackened lungs, skin stained black, even in places soap couldn't reach. And their minds also paid a price that no one spoke openly about, but that everyone recognized in the eyes of those who had lived through it for too long. Elias Mercer was born into this environment. We don't have a precise date, and that in itself says a lot about the kind of life he led. Deep in the Appalachian countryside during the second half of the 19th century, many people lived and died without any official record being kept, not because they were forgotten by their neighbors, but because the state simply didn't reach them. There was no registry office, no doctor, no authority within many hours' journey on horseback. The law, when it existed, was the law of the strongest or the most feared. And Elias Mercer, according to accounts that have survived the test of time, passed down orally through generations until reaching the notes of researchers who traveled through those regions decades later, was definitely feared. Described as a man of imposing stature, with hands far too large for a normal human being, and a gaze that, according to those attempting to describe him, seemed to pierce through a person as if they were made of glass. He wasn't the kind of man you struck up a conversation with casually. He wasn't the kind of man you'd discuss the price of a batch of coal with, without carefully considering every word spoken. And he was certainly not the kind of man whose personal affairs someone of good sense would try to investigate. What set Elias Mercer apart from the other hardened, closed-off miners of the Appalachians wasn't just his physical appearance. It was a combination of things that together created an aura of genuine unease around him. He worked in the mines like everyone else, but he didn't need the mines to survive. He owned land, extensive by the standards of that region, a property that climbed uphill, shaded by old gnarled oak trees, crossed by a stream whose local name, in the language of the region's early settlers, meant something close to water that doesn't return. No one knew exactly how he had acquired that land, and no one asked. The nearest neighbors, and near here meant several miles away, because isolation was a natural part of that landscape, maintained a relationship with Elias that today we would define as carefully distant. They were cordial when they met him on the way to the mine or at the store where people bought supplies. They greeted him with a nod, exchanged words about the weather or the price of coal, but no one went to his property uninvited, and invitations, it seems, were extremely rare. What people knew or thought they knew about Elias Mercer was made up of loose fragments. An observation here, a story there, a detail someone mentioned almost unintentionally and then seemed to regret saying. The fact that he rarely slept indoors during the summer months and was seen walking around the property boundaries at times that made no sense to any man with a normal routine. The fact that his dogs, large, silent, of a breed no one could identify for sure, seemed trained not to bark at strangers, only to observe them with that cold, motionless attention that makes anyone uncomfortable. The fact that travelers passing by the road near his property at night sometimes swore they saw light coming from the higher parts of the land, at times that no honest work would justify. They were fragments, just fragments. But in 19th century Appalachians, fragments are sometimes all that exists. And sometimes, fragments are more than enough to paint a picture that no direct word would ever dare to fully describe. What began to draw attention in a more concrete way was not any single dramatic event. It was something much slower and, therefore, much more disturbing. Over several years, people who had regular contact with communities near Elias Mercer's property began to notice a growing absence. Not of strangers, but of acquaintances. Men who worked in the same mine as Elias, who had been seen talking to him, who had been invited, on one of the rare occasions, to visit the property for some work or business, and who simply wouldn't show up again in the following weeks. Now, disappearances weren't exactly uncommon in that region and at that time. The Appalachians were a transit point for many people. Migrant workers following coal from mine to mine, men fleeing debt or complicated situations in other states, travelers taking wrong turns in the mountains and encountering accidents that no one ever discovered. Silent and anonymous death was almost commonplace in that context. So when someone disappeared, the tendency was to assume they had moved on, continued on, or simply met an unfortunate end somewhere along the way. But there was something different about the disappearances linked to Elias Mercer's circle, something that people took a while to put into words, but which began to take shape in a silent, collective perception. Men who disappeared after having contact with him left no trace in the normal sense. There were no reports that they had passed through neighboring towns. There were no stories of anyone having seen them in another county. They simply ceased to exist on the known horizon of that community, as if the Appalachian fog had absorbed them forever. And Elias Mercer remained there, on the same property, with the same silent puppies, with the same inexplicable lights on the higher parts of the land, with the same gaze that pierced people like glass, impassive, rooted, as if the surrounding mountains were complicit in a silence that no one dared to break. The question that no one could answer, and that few dared to ask aloud, was simple and yet impossible to answer with certainty. What exactly was happening inside that property? Elias Mercer's lands occupied a geographical position that seemed tailor-made for isolation. The main entrance was on a dirt road that branched off from the main path like a crooked branch, climbing in a sharp curve between oak trees so old that their roots had deformed the surrounding soil, creating strange reliefs that, depending on the time of day and the available light, resembled shapes that human imagination preferred not to name. After this initial climb, the property opened up onto a kind of irregular plateau, surrounded on three sides by dense vegetation, and on the fourth side by an outcrop of dark stone that the locals simply called the Wall, without any embellishment in the name, as if the place itself needed no description. The house itself was solid, built with hand-worked logs, the kind that lasted generations in the mountains, covered by a slatted roof that time had darkened almost black. It wasn't the house of a careless man. On the contrary, it was the house of someone who understood very well the relationship between structure and permanence. Tools lined up outside were kept clean and organized. The firewood was always cut and stacked with almost geometric precision. There was a small but well-tended vegetable garden in the back, and a barn whose doors, according to those who had passed close enough to observe, were always locked with an iron padlock that seemed too heavy to hold only animals or common equipment. This was the padlock that frequently appeared in the whispered stories about Elias Mercer, not because anyone knew what was inside the barn, but precisely because nobody knew. And because on the few occasions when someone had asked, with the casual naturalness one uses to ask about anything in a neighborly conversation, Elias would answer in a way that ended the subject without brutality and without any sign of discomfort. Just a long look, a pause that lasted a second longer than it should have, and then a short, vague answer that said nothing and at the same time made it clear that this was the end of the conversation. There was a man, referred to in the accounts only by the nickname Coot, as was common in the region for people of a certain age and a certain type of presence, who worked for a few weeks repairing a fence on the boundary of Elias's property, some years before the disappearances began to be more widely noticed. Coot was the type of person who observed a lot and spoke little, which in the culture of those mountains was considered a virtue almost as important as honesty. And what he observed during those weeks of work was later described by him with visible reluctance to at least 2 different people who eventually repeated the story. According to Coot, there was something about Elias's behavior that didn't fit into any known category of human strangeness. It wasn't madness, at least not the kind you recognize at first glance. It was more as if Elias inhabited a completely different set of rules than everyone else used to live by. Rules he followed with full awareness and deliberation, but which had no correspondence with the shared world around him. He always woke up at the same time, regardless of the day of the week or the weather. He ate in absolute silence. He never hummed, never whistled, never made any of those insignificant sounds that human beings unconsciously produce when they are relaxed and comfortable in their own space. And there was something else Coot mentioned with particular hesitation. During the weeks he worked there, he never saw Elias Mercer sleep. Not that he stayed awake watching. There was simply never any sign that the man had rested. Early in the morning, when Coot arrived for work, Elias was already awake and on the move. Late at night, when Coot passed by the property on his way home, he saw the light on in the front window and the silhouette of Elias sitting at the table, motionless, looking at something that wasn't visible from the outside. That image, the motionless silhouette at the window, at hours when no honest man was yet awake, would become one of the most recurring in stories about Elias Mercer. Because others had seen it too. Travelers passing by on the nearby road, people descending the mountain after night work in the mine, even an itinerant preacher who traveled those routes regularly and who, when asked about the man on the property on the hill, made the sign of the cross before answering anything. And even then, what he replied was only that there were lights in that place that shouldn't exist at times, when every man with a clear conscience had already surrendered to sleep. What made all this even more disturbing was the absence of any direct confrontation with Elias. He didn't threaten. He didn't violently expel curious onlookers. He didn't do anything that could be clearly pointed out as wrong or illegal within the lax and distant standards of the law in that region. It was more as if he knew with a precision that was disconcerting in itself exactly where the line lay between what could be observed and what needed to remain invisible. And he always operated a few steps behind that line, with an awareness that was almost artistic in its precision. The disappearances, as we've already mentioned, weren't announced. There were no dramatic disappearances with searches in the woods or desperate families in the streets. It was more subtle than that, which made everything harder to name. A man would stop showing up at the mine. After a few days, someone would ask about him. The most common answer was a shrug. Probably he left, like so many do. And for a while, that was it. Life went on with the indifference that survival demands. But then it would happen again, and again, and with a regularity that slowly began to be noticed by people who had good memories and a habit of paying attention to patterns around them. One of these people was a woman named Dora, the wife of a miner who worked in the same mine as Elias. Dora was known in the small community as someone you could talk to when you needed something remembered precisely, dates, names, details of old conversations. She had the kind of mind that catalogued information effortlessly and rarely let it slip. And it was Dora who, at some point the accounts don't specify exactly, began keeping a mental count of the men who disappeared, after having had direct contact with Elias Mercer. She didn't immediately share this count with anyone. In Appalachia, accusing a neighbor, even indirectly, even if only in the form of suspicion, required much more than a series of coincidences. It required certainty. And certainty was precisely what was lacking. All Dora had was a mental list of names and a growing feeling that the pattern she was observing wasn't accidental. It took a few more disappearances, and one specific event that irreversibly changed the nature of the situation, for the collective silence surrounding Elias Mercer to finally begin to crack. The event that changed everything wasn't noisy. It didn't arrive with shouts or confrontations on the main street of any city. It arrived the way almost everything arrives in the mountains, slowly, carried by the mouth of a single person, on an ordinary afternoon when the sky over the Appalachians was low and grey and the air smelled of rain that hadn't yet fallen. A man named Harlan had returned. That in itself was extraordinary, because Harlan was exactly the kind of person who should have disappeared. He had spent 3 days on Elias Mercer's property, hired for a carpentry job that was never quite clear in its details, fixing something inside the barn according to one version, making repairs to the roof of the house according to another. The fact is that Harlan had entered that property with his tools on his shoulder one Monday morning, and the surrounding community had, almost instinctively, begun to mentally prepare him for Dora's silent list. But Harlan returned on Thursday. He returned different, that was obvious, thinner than he should have been after only 3 days, with the eyes of someone who hadn't slept well, or who had slept too much and woken up worse than when he went to bed, with a way of walking that some described as overly cautious, as if the ground could give way beneath his feet at any moment. But he returned, and that was enough to make people want to know what they had seen. The problem was that Harlan didn't want to talk, not in the aggressive way of someone who has a secret and will defend it to the end. It was more of a gentle refusal, almost pathetic in its intensity, like someone who clearly wants to forget something and knows that talking about it will prevent forgetting. When someone asked about the property, about Elias, about what he had done there for 3 days, Harlan changed the subject with a skill that didn't match his direct and simple manner before the visit. When someone insisted, he remained quiet, with a silence that was too heavy to be mere stubbornness. It was Dora herself who finally got something out of him, not because she was more persistent than the others, but because she approached Harlan in a different way. She didn't ask about what he had seen. She asked about how he had felt, and that difference, small as it seems, opened a crack that Harlan's silence couldn't completely close. What came out of that crack was fragmented. Harlan didn't describe events sequentially. He didn't tell a story with a beginning, middle, and end. He let out pieces, sometimes in the middle of conversations about completely different things, as if the words escaped on their own before he could retain them. And Dora, with her precise memory and her instinct for cataloguing details, pieced those fragments together over the course of days. What she put together wasn't a confession, it wasn't proof of anything, but it was disturbing in a way that stayed with you. Harlan had spent the nights on the property sleeping in a small room at the back of the house, separated from the main area by a door that, he noticed on the very first day, had no lock on the inside, only on the outside. This hadn't been mentioned by Elias as something significant. It was presented with the same nonchalance as someone talking about the color of a wall or the direction of a window. But Harlan had noticed. And on the first night, awake in the dark, he had also noticed the sounds. They weren't dramatic sounds, they weren't screams or violent noises. They were low rhythmic sounds coming from somewhere below the floor level of the house, suggesting a basement, although Harlan had never seen an entrance to it anywhere he had searched. Sounds that he described, after much hesitation, as similar to the slow movement of something very heavy being dragged across packed earth, and then complete silence, the kind of silence that seems louder than any noise. The next morning, Elias had appeared at the usual time, served the coffee with the same mechanical precision as always, and had made no mention of whatever had happened during the night. Harlan hadn't asked either, and this mutual absence of any reference to what had happened was, in itself, a form of communication, a communication that clearly said, "You don't ask, and I don't need to explain." The work was done. Harlan received what had been agreed upon, in coins counted with Elias's characteristic precision, not a penny more or less. And on Thursday morning, as he descended the hill with his tools on his shoulder, he felt, in his own fragmented words, as if the trees surrounding the property were looking at him, not threateningly, just observing, in the same way the dogs observed, with that cold total attention that needs no movement to make itself felt. When Dora finished piecing these fragments together in her head, she remained silent for a while, processing what they contained. Taken in isolation, each detail could be explained. A door without a lock on the inside could simply be carelessness or an old habit. Nighttime sounds in an old wooden house were normal in any mountain. Elias's distant behavior was simply Elias's distant behavior, which had never been any different. But together, those fragments formed a pattern that Dora couldn't ignore. And the pattern pointed to something she didn't yet have precise words to name, but which she felt with the unsettling clarity of someone who recognizes a danger before being able to identify it. It was during this period that she began to speak to other people more directly. Not accusing, not making claims she couldn't substantiate, just asking questions. Who had Elias spoken to lately? Who had climbed that hill and not come back down? If anyone else had noticed the pattern she was seeing. And that's when she discovered she wasn't alone. There were at least 3 other people in the small community who had been asking similar questions, each on their own, each with different pieces of the same picture. An older man who worked at the mine had noticed that all those who disappeared had one specific characteristic in common. They were people without close family in the region. Single, widowed, transient workers who didn't have roots deep enough for anyone to insist on searching for them with determination when they vanished. The kind of person whose disappearance could be absorbed into the standard narrative of someone who left without saying goodbye. Another younger man had noticed something different. The occasions when Elias invited someone to the property followed a rhythm. They weren't frequent, but they weren't random either. There was a regular interval between them, as if they obeyed their own logic that had nothing to do with the actual need for work or service. As if the invitation itself were the point, and the stated reason for it was merely the delivery mechanism. When these perceptions began to circulate among the few people willing to speak openly about Elias Mercer, something changed in the air of that community. It was a change difficult to describe precisely. It wasn't panic, it wasn't revolt. It was more like the moment when the morning mist begins to dissipate, and the forms that were hidden within it begin, very slowly, to take on recognizable contours. And Elias Mercer remained there, on the property, with the silent dogs, with the lights in the window at nonsensical hours, impassive as always, rooted in those mountains, as if he were part of the very stone. Completely oblivious or completely indifferent to the fact that, for the first time in many years, the silence around him was beginning to crack. The first person to take concrete action was a man named Wesley. Wesley wasn't the type of person who naturally assumed leadership positions. He was a middle-aged man, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands from decades of work in the mines, and a measured way of speaking that some people mistook for slowness, but was actually the opposite. It was the speech of someone who thinks before opening his mouth, who weighs each word before letting it utter a word. He was respected in the community not for being the strongest or the richest, but for consistently being the most honest. And honesty in those mountains was worth more than any other currency. Wesley had lost a close friend a few months ago, a man named Rupert, who had worked alongside him at the mine for almost 4 years and who had disappeared after accepting an invitation from Elias Mercer for a day's work on the property. Wesley had waited. He had asked. He had heard the usual explanations about people who simply leave without saying goodbye. And he had remained silent for a while, because Wesley was the type of person who needed to be sure before speaking. But after listening to Dora, after talking to the others who had noticed the patterns, Wesley decided he was sure enough to take the next step. This step wasn't about going directly to Elias. Wesley was honest, not reckless. What he did was arrange a conversation between the people who were sharing those insights. Not a formal meeting, nothing that might draw attention or seem like a conspiracy, but a casual encounter in the courtyard of one of the community homes on a Sunday afternoon when work was slow and people had time to stand and talk, without it seeming out of the ordinary. There were 6 people in total. Besides Wesley and Dora, there was the oldest man in the mine who had noticed the profile of the missing people, the young man who had perceived the rhythm of the invitations, a woman named Agnes who lived on the road closest to Elias's property and who had her own observations accumulated over years of involuntary proximity, and a former miner named Tobias who had moved to that region about 2 years ago and who, being an outsider, had a slightly different perspective on what was normal and what was not in that specific place. The conversation lasted all afternoon, and for long periods was more silence than words, because the central problem was always the same. What they had was a collection of observations, suspicions, and patterns that made sense together, but separated, could be innocently explained. There was nothing that could be called evidence in the sense that any external authority would recognize it. And external authority in that region and at that time was itself a complicated concept. The county sheriff was many hours away. There was no telegraph nearby, and even if there were some form of quick communication with some authority, what exactly would they say? That a strange neighbor was receiving people on the property, and that these people sometimes didn't return. In 19th century Appalachia, that would barely raise an eyebrow in a lawman accustomed to the brutal reality of that region. It was Agnes who brought the most concrete observation of the afternoon. Having lived on the nearby road for years, she had developed the involuntary habit of paying attention to the movements around Elias's property, simply because there wasn't much else to observe on that deserted road. And what she had noticed over that time was an irregularity in the property's terrain that had gradually appeared. At the highest point of the property, beyond the line of oak trees that marked the visual boundary of the cultivated area, there was a stretch of land that had changed its appearance over the years. Not dramatically, nothing that would immediately catch the eye of someone passing by at a glance. But Agnes, who had been observing that landscape long enough to know every variation of it, had noticed that the terrain in that specific section presented a subtle irregularity that hadn't been there years before. A series of elevations and depressions in the ground that didn't follow the natural logic of the mountain's relief. She didn't say the word that everyone in the conversation circle immediately thought of upon hearing it. No one said it. But the word hung over the group with the solidity of a stone, and the silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when a thought that is too heavy lands in the middle of a conversation and no one has the courage to be the first to acknowledge it aloud. It was Tobias, the outsider, who finally broke the silence, and he did so not by talking about what everyone was thinking, but by asking a practical question that steered the conversation onto somewhat firmer ground. He asked if anyone had tried to find out more about Elias Mercer's background, about where he had come from before settling on that property, about whether there was any record of who he had been before becoming the man on the hill with the silent dogs and the lights in the window. The response was a different kind of silence, the silence of someone who realizes they never thought to ask a seemingly obvious question. No one knew where Elias had come from. He was simply there on the property when the people of that community began to pay attention to him. There was no story of his arrival. There was no account of how he had acquired the land or where he had come from before. It was as if he had sprouted from that mountain along with the oak trees and the ominous named stream, a natural part of a landscape that no one had thought to question. This gap, when identified, produced a new discomfort within the group, because realizing that absolutely nothing is known about the origins of a person shrouded in a cloud of disappearances is different from simply suspecting them. It's understanding that the mystery runs deeper than it seemed, that the roots of the problem extend beyond what any of them could reach with the tools they had available. Wesley remained silent for a long time after this revelation. Then he said in his slow, measured voice that there was only one concrete thing they could do without exposing themselves to any direct confrontation with Elias or any ridicule before distant authorities who probably wouldn't hear them. They could observe. Systematically and in a coordinated way, each covering a different angle, they could build over time a more complete record of what was happening on that property, of Elias's movements, of the visitors who went up and didn't come down, of the changes in the terrain that Agnes had noticed. It wasn't a heroic plan. There was nothing dramatic about the proposal. It was the idea of ordinary people, powerless and without resources, trying to do the only thing within their reach in the face of something beyond their control. And it was accepted with the quiet seriousness of those who understand that sometimes that's all that exists between silence and some twisted, imperfect form of justice. What none of them knew at that moment was that Elias Mercer, with that almost supernatural perception of limits and observation that had characterized his entire existence in those mountains, had already noticed the change around him. He had already perceived that the silence that had always protected him was different, not broken yet, but different, with that specific quality of silence that precedes something, and that he was in his own precise and deliberate way preparing for it. The surveillance organized by the group lasted several weeks before producing anything concrete. Agnes was the most privileged observer due to her geographical position, and she was the first to notice the change in Elias's behavior. A small change, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying attention, with the kind of focus the group had developed in the previous weeks. Elias had begun to do something he had never done before with the regularity he now demonstrated, descending from the property. It wasn't that he never went down. He went to the store to buy groceries, showed up at the mine on workdays, passed people on the road without averting his gaze or quickening his pace. But there was a difference between his usual walks down and what Agnes was observing now. Elias was patrolling. There was no other word to describe it. He walked along the outer boundaries of the property at varying times, not following any fixed pattern, as if deliberately avoiding being predictable. He would walk down to the main road and stand there for a few minutes, looking towards the neighboring houses with that motionless attention that was his trademark. Then he would walk back up unhurriedly, with the dogs by his side, silent as always. It was the behavior of someone who had realized they were being watched and who was, in their own way, mapping out where the observation was coming from. When Agnes reported this to the group, the effect was immediate and uncomfortable. The feeling that they were investigating Elias was abruptly replaced by the feeling that Elias was investigating them. And this reversal changed the dynamic of everything. Because observing someone from a distance has a specific quality of security, the illusion that the observer is invisible. When that illusion breaks down, what remains is exposure. And exposure, in that context, was something none of the six were prepared to face. Wesley was the only one who didn't seem disturbed by the news the way the others were. He remained quiet for a moment, as was his habit, and then said something that stuck in the minds of everyone present for a long time afterward. He said that the fact that Elias had noticed the observation wasn't necessarily a bad thing. That a man who acts in the shadows because he believes no one is paying attention acts differently from a man who knows he is being watched. And that perhaps the only real protection any of them had at that moment was precisely that, being seen being watched, making the mutual surveillance explicit enough for Elias to understand that anything that happened to either of them would not go unnoticed. It was a logic of protection through visibility, fragile, improbable, without any real guarantee, but it was all they had. What happened in the following days tested this logic in ways that none of them had fully anticipated. Tobias, the outsider who had asked about Elias's origins, had pursued that line of inquiry on his own after the group's conversation. He had traveled to a larger town in the valley, a few hours' ride away on horseback, where there was a greater concentration of people and consequently a broader collective memory of the movements of individuals throughout the region. He had spent 2 days talking to people in shops, taverns, and anywhere else where stories were freely exchanged. What he brought back was fragmented, like everything else in this story, but it had a different weight than the previous fragments. Elias Mercer had appeared in that region approximately 20 years ago. Before that there were rumors, only rumors, with nothing verifiable, that he had lived in at least 2 other places in the Appalachians before settling where he was now. In both places, according to what Tobias had managed to gather from scattered conversations with people who had long memories and a willingness to talk, there were similar stories. People disappearing, patterns that no one could precisely name, but that left a trail of unease in the communities where Elias had passed through. And in both places, Elias had simply left before anything concrete crystallized around him, as if he had a keen sense of the exact moment when the surrounding environment began to become too dangerous to remain. As if the same perception that made him map the observers around his current property also warned him with enough advance notice when it was time to move. When Tobias presented this to the group, the silence was long and heavy, because what that information suggested was that they were dealing not with a man who had developed a disturbing pattern in a single place over many years, but with someone who carried that pattern with him, who had practiced it in multiple places over decades, and who had survived all previous suspicions without ever being definitively confronted. A man with practice, with specific experience in existing precisely on the boundary between what could be observed and what could not be proven. Dora said what everyone was thinking, but no one had voiced aloud until that moment. If Elias had left from elsewhere before anything concrete could be done, and if he had realized he was being watched now, then there was a very real possibility that he was preparing to do the same again, to simply disappear from the property with the same ease with which he had arrived, leaving behind only silence, the uneven terrain on the upper part of the property, and yet another community with questions that would never be answered. And this time, Dora said with a calmness that contrasted with the weight of what she was saying, they were in a different position from those who had been through the same situation before. Because they knew the pattern. Because they had connected the dots in a way that previous communities probably hadn't been able to, and because there was something they could do that previous communities might not have considered, they could go all the way to the uneven terrain. The proposal landed in the middle of the group like a stone in still water. The circles it produced were of silence and exchanged glances that contained entire conversations without a single word, because everyone understood what going to that land meant. It wasn't just a matter of violating the property of a feared man. It was a matter of potentially confirming what Dora's mental list, Agnes's observations, Tobias's pattern, and the memory of the oldest man in the mine only suggested. It was a matter of transforming suspicion into something that could no longer be ignored or explained otherwise. Wesley remained quiet for longer than usual before responding. When he spoke, he said there was a difference between what needed to be done and what either of them had the right or ability to do alone. That climbing that hill toward the uneven terrain while Elias Mercer was there was a form of recklessness that served no useful purpose. But that there was a time, a specific window, when Elias regularly left the property for an extended period. Every first Monday of the month, Elias would go down to the mine to receive payment for the overtime he had worked irregularly. This process took all morning, sometimes extending into the early afternoon, because it involved a series of checks and conversations with the supervisor that were never quick. It was the only predictable time Elias was absent from the property for an extended period. The next first Monday of the month was less than 2 weeks away. The group was left with that, with the weight of those 2 weeks ahead, with the awareness of what they were considering doing, and with the persistent image of the uneven terrain on the high part of Elias Mercer's property, where the old oak trees cast long shadows even in the middle of the day, and where the sinister-named stream flowed with a low murmur that, depending on the wind and the time of day, sounded almost like words. The 2 weeks that separated the group from the first Monday of the month were the longest any of them had ever lived in that community, not because there was any dramatic event during that interval. On the contrary, it was precisely the absence of events that made that period so heavy. Life continued with its usual routine, the mine, the supplies, the roadside conversations, the Appalachian sky shifting from gray to blue and back to gray with the characteristic indifference of the mountains to the human dramas unfolding at their feet. And beneath this normal surface, the group carried the weight of what they were planning with the silence of those who know that some things, once spoken aloud too often, lose the protection of secrecy. Elias continued his rounds. Agnes observed him with the discretion of someone who has learned to look without being noticed, and reported to the group that his behavior had stabilized into constant but not escalated vigilance. He hadn't made any move that suggested imminent departure. The property was intact, the barn still locked, the puppies still silent in their usual places. It was as if Elias had registered the change around him, and decided, at least for now, simply to observe back without altering any other aspect of his existence. This, paradoxically, was more disturbing than if he had reacted more visibly, because that man's restraint was always more frightening than any outburst could be. It was the restraint of someone who never acts impulsively, who calculates each step with a foresight that most people cannot sustain. And calculating in that context meant that whatever Elias did in response to what he had perceived would be done at the moment and in the way he considered most efficient. Not before, not after, and not in a way that could be easily anticipated. Harlan, the only man who had ever entered the property and returned, had vanished from the community during those 2 weeks. Not dramatically, he had simply stopped showing up at his usual haunts. Some said he had moved to a neighboring county for a longer carpentry job. Others simply didn't know. Dora had tried to speak to him once more before his discreet disappearance, but he had brushed her off with that soft, pathetic refusal of someone who wants to forget something that contact with certain people inevitably brings to mind. Harlan's absence was felt by the group as a bad omen, although no one articulated it directly. It was just another layer of unease in a period that was already saturated with discomfort. Monday arrived with a cold, overcast morning, the kind of Appalachian morning where the fog descends so low that it obscures the mountain peaks and leaves the landscape looking like an unfinished world, as if creation had stopped midway and never resumed. The group had arranged to meet at a specific point on the road, a safe distance from the property entrance, an hour after Elias was seen descending the hill toward the mine. Agnes was to confirm the departure. When she saw Elias come down with his long, steady strides, the dogs staying behind at the property line, as they always did when he left, she waited long enough to be sure there was no sign of his imminent return, and then went to warn the others. There were 5 of them when they climbed the hill. Tobias had decided the day before that he wouldn't go. He'd given a vague explanation about an urgent commitment, but the truth that no one verbalized was that everyone's limit for this kind of thing is different, and Tobias's had been reached. No one judged him. Wesley, Dora, Agnes, the oldest man in the mine, whose name appears in the accounts only as Heck, and the young man who had noticed the rhythm of the invitations, called in the fragments of accounts only as Cal. These 5 went up. The entrance to the property early in the morning, with the mist still thick and the silence of the mountains weighing on everything, had a different quality than any of them had imagined. More immediate, more physical. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves was strong, and the ancient oaks on the slopes created a corridor of shade that the mist made almost solid. Feet sank slightly into the soaked ground, leaving marks that everyone was aware they were leaving and that there was no way to avoid. The house was locked. The barn was locked as always. The dogs were nowhere to be seen, which was in itself information. They had gone with Elias, something Agnes hadn't noticed before, and which, on reflection, made sense for a man who left nothing vulnerable when he was away. Wesley gestured toward the higher part of the property, beyond the line of oak trees. No one spoke. They climbed in a line with Cal in front because he was the youngest and most agile, and Heck at the back because he was the slowest, but also the one with the most trained eyes to perceive movement at a distance. The land beyond the line of oak trees was different from the rest of the property in a way that became immediately clear upon stepping onto it. The vegetation was lower, less orderly, as if that area did not receive the same systematic care as the rest, and the soil, as Agnes had described, presented those subtle irregularities that did not follow the natural logic of the terrain. Cal was the first to stop. He stood still for a moment, staring at the ground in front of him with an expression that the others, arriving one by one, recognized even before looking where he was looking. There was nothing visible on the surface, but there was something in the pattern of the soil, in the way the earth had been moved and settled at different times, that told a story without words. A story that the 5 read in silence, each at their own pace, each arriving at the same conclusion in their own way. There was more than one such spot, scattered without apparent order across that stretch of land, but with a regularity that wasn't natural. Dora began to count in a very low voice, almost to herself. She stopped at 7 before Wesley placed his hand on her arm, with a gentleness that was also a request for silence. They stayed there for a time that neither of them could later estimate. With the mist all around, with the silence of the mountains, with the sinister named stream murmuring somewhere below them, with the weight of what they had confirmed without words, and which they now carried together, without any clear idea of what to do with it. It was Heck who first looked down the hill, toward the road, with that keen instinct of someone who had spent decades paying attention to dangerous environments. And it was Heck who said, in a low but absolutely firm voice, that they needed to go down. Now. Not because he had seen or heard anything concrete, but because he had learned in many years of mining and mountaineering to trust the kind of feeling that precedes danger, even before the danger is visible. They descended, quickly, silently, retracing their steps between the ancient oak trees, the thick mist still surrounding them, the marks of their own feet in the soaked earth guiding their return. They reached the road and continued walking without stopping, without looking back, without speaking, until they were at a distance that Wesley considered sufficient so that anyone coming down the hill would no longer see them. Then they stopped, and they looked at each other with that kind of look that doesn't need words because words would be insufficient anyway. What to do with what they had seen was a question none of the five could answer at that moment, because what they had seen was both everything and nothing, enough for inner certainty, but insufficient for anything the outside world would recognize as proof. And Elias Mercer would be back from the mine in a few hours, walking along that same road with his long, steady strides, back to the property where the locked barn and the uneven terrain would guard their secrets, with the same impassivity as always. The fog began to slowly dissipate as the five stood by the road, and the surrounding mountains reappeared in their true outlines, solid and indifferent as they always had been, and none of them could decide whether this return of clarity was comforting or simply another form of silent cruelty from that place. The decision about what to do with what they had seen did not come that day, nor the next. It came in fragments, like almost everything else in this story, through scattered conversations that took place in the days following the climb up the hill, and it came accompanied by a complication that none of the five had fully anticipated, although in retrospect it seemed inevitable. Elias had noticed the marks. There was no way to know for sure how he had noticed. Perhaps he knew every inch of that terrain, with an intimacy that made any change immediately visible. Perhaps the dogs, returning with him from the mine that afternoon, had detected the tracks with that silent sensitivity that had always characterized them. Perhaps it was simply that almost supernatural perception of boundaries and observation that had defined his entire existence in those mountains. How he knew was irrelevant. The fact was that he knew. Agnes was the first to notice the change. The morning after the climb, as she observed the property from the road with her usual care, she noticed that Elias was on the outer edge of the land, exactly where the line of oak trees began. He was standing there looking down the hill towards the road, doing nothing, just looking, with that characteristic stillness that was always more expressive than any gesture could be. But there was something different about that stillness now, a new quality that Agnes, after some time trying to find the right word, described to the group as deliberate, as if Elias wasn't just looking, but showing that he was looking, making his awareness of what had happened explicit in the only way he used to make anything explicit, without words, without direct confrontation, just with the impassive and calculated presence that was his language. It was an answer that said, with all the clarity that silence can produce, that he knew, and that they knew that he knew, and that now all sides of this strange and dark situation had reached the same point of mutual awareness without a single direct word having been exchanged. Wesley gathered the group that same night. The conversation was different from previous ones in tone and urgency, because the situation had changed in nature. Before, the imbalance was in Elias's favor. He had his secrets, and they only had suspicions. Now there was a new imbalance, and this one weighed differently. They had seen the uneven ground. Elias knew they had seen it, and the question Wesley posed to the group with that measured voice that cut straight to the heart of the matter was simple and terrifying in its simplicity. What does a man like Elias Mercer do when he realizes that people around him know too much? No one answered immediately, because the answer was available to everyone. It was available in Dora's mental list, in the pattern of the previous communities Tobias had encountered, in the very nature of what they had seen on the ground beyond the oak trees. A man who had operated the way Elias had operated for decades in multiple places, without ever being definitively confronted, didn't reach this point by chance. He did because he was extremely careful, and careful in that context meant eliminating anything that threatened the secret. It was Dora who said aloud what everyone's logic indicated, that they were in danger. Not in an abstract or hypothetical way, but in a concrete and immediate way, proportional to how much Elias considered each of them to represent a threat to the balance he had maintained for so long. The question was what to do about this danger. The options were brutally limited. They could try to reach out to some outside authority, but that meant days of travel, explanations that would sound improbable without any tangible evidence, and a period of vulnerability during which they would be completely exposed without any protection. They could simply pretend nothing had happened, return to their previous cautious distance, and hope that Elias would consider the threat manageable, but that ignored everything they had learned about how he operated when he sensed the surrounding environment became too dangerous. And they could do something none of them had seriously considered until that moment, but which the situation was making increasingly inevitable. They could make what they knew so widely known that it would become impossible to contain the disappearance of just 5 people. This was the only real protection that Wesley's logic of visibility offered in its fullest form. Not merely being seen, but making knowledge so diffuse, so spread among so many people, that eliminating the sources of that knowledge became a task that not even a man with the patience and calculation of Elias Mercer could accomplish without becoming visible himself in a way that could no longer be managed. It was a gamble based on the assumption that Elias, above all, prioritized his own continuity and invisibility, and that a threat too great to be contained would be recognized by him as such. But it was also the only gamble that seemed to have any real logic behind it. Over the next 2 days, each of the 5 had conversations. Careful conversations, calculated to convey the weight of what they knew without causing panic, with trusted people in different parts of the community and neighboring communities. There was nothing that resembled a formal accusation. It was more of a silent dissemination of perceptions, patterns, observations, the same kind of fragment that had circulated for years in a disorganized way, now deliberately directed to the largest possible number of people with good memories and a willingness to pay attention. The effect was faster than anyone had expected, because it turns out that the silence surrounding Elias Mercer wasn't as uniform as it seemed. There were other people, in different parts of the community and the surrounding area, who had made their own observations over the years and who had remained silent for the same combination of uncertainty, isolation, and lack of context that would make what they had individually meaningful. When the fragments of the group of 5 met these other scattered fragments, the picture that emerged was larger and more solid than anyone had imagined. There was a merchant in a small town a few hours away who had sold supplies to Elias regularly for years, and who had noticed, without ever mentioning it to anyone, that the types of supplies purchased sometimes included quantities that made no sense for a man living alone on a property of that size. There was a family living at another point on the same road as Agnes, who had seen on one occasion 2 men climbing the hill toward Elias's property one afternoon, and who had noticed, without giving it much thought at the time, that only 1 man had come down before nightfall. Each new fragment that reached the group was simultaneously a confirmation and an added burden. Confirmation of what they already knew. Burden from the accumulation of a story that had lasted decades and that had silently consumed, without leaving sufficiently visible traces, a number of people that Dora's mental list was beginning to suggest was larger than anyone had initially considered. And while all this was happening, Elias Mercer remained on the property. Agnes continued her observations and reported that he had resumed a seemingly normal routine, the work on the edges of the property, the lights in the window at impossible hours, the dogs silent at their posts. But there was a difference now that Agnes had precisely identified after a few days of careful observation. Elias had stopped making his rounds. She had stopped going down to the road to observe the neighboring houses with that calculated stillness. She had stopped mapping where the observations around her were coming from. And Agnes, with that perspicacity that had made her observations the most valuable in the group, said that the absence of the patrols worried her more than the patrols themselves had worried her. Because a man who stops actively observing what is around him is not necessarily a man who has given up. He is potentially a man who has finished calculating what he needed to calculate and is now in an entirely different phase. a phase that, in everyone's experience of how Elijah operated, came after observation and before any action. Wesley listened to this with his characteristic quietness, and then he said that there was one thing they needed to do urgently, before any further phase of Elijah's calculation became a reality. Something they had postponed because it was the most difficult and uncertain of all the available options. They needed someone from the outside, someone with enough authority so that the weight of what they knew could land somewhere that couldn't simply be absorbed by the silence of the mountains, as so many other things had been absorbed before. The question was whether they could bring this person before Elias Mercer finished what he had been calculating during the quiet hours inside that dark log cabin, with the lights on at times, when no man with a clear conscience would need light. In 19th century Appalachians, finding someone from outside with enough authority to ensure that the weight of all that could be placed somewhere concrete was a task that combined physical distance with obstacles that would be difficult to imagine today. The county sheriff lived in a town called Harlan, not the person, the town, a distance that on horseback along the mountain roads at that time of year represented a journey of almost 2 full days, considering the terrain and the need to avoid pushing the animals beyond what the ups and downs of that geography allowed. There was no telegraph in that part of the mountains. There was no form of communication other than the human body carrying words from one point to another across the rugged terrain. Wesley made the decision alone, the night after the conversation about Elias's interrupted rounds. He didn't consult the group that time. He simply showed up the next morning with his horse ready, and with the air of someone who has already resolved an issue internally and no longer needs to deliberate on it. He told the group he would be back in 4 days, 5 at most. He asked Agnes to continue the observations. He asked Dora to continue gathering any new fragments that emerged. And he asked Cal and Heck to remain visible, deliberately visible, present in their usual places at the mine, at the store, on the road, so that any change in the pattern of either of them would be immediately noticed by enough people. Then he left without ceremony, walking down the road in the morning mist with that long, steady stride which, curiously, reminded everyone of the stride of another man on that same road. The next 4 days were the strangest of the whole story. Strange, not because something dramatic happened, but because nothing happened, and the nothingness in that specific context had a dense, almost physical texture that was different from the normal silence of those mountains. It was the silence of something contained, of something about to move that hadn't yet moved. Elias continued his routine with a regularity that Agnes described as artificial, not in the sense of forced or nervous. Elias showed no recognizable nervousness, but in the sense of deliberately normal, as if each action were chosen consciously, aware that it was being observed and constructed to convey a message of continuity and imperturbability. He woke up, went to work, entered and left the house at the same times, the dogs by his side with their cold, constant attention. It was the performance of normality by someone who perfectly understood the difference between being normal and appearing normal. Dora collected 2 more fragments during this period, which added layers to what they already knew. The first came from a man who had worked briefly in the region's mines a few years before and was passing through that community on a longer trip. Upon hearing the name Elias Mercer mentioned in a conversation at the store, he had fallen silent in a way that Dora, with her keen instinct for meaningful silences, had noticed and followed. With patience and the indirect approach that had worked with Harlan, she managed to get the man to speak. He had met Elias in one of the earlier communities that Tobias had identified. He hadn't worked directly with him, but he had been a neighbor of someone who had. And what remained in this man's memory, with a clarity that time had not erased, was a conversation with that neighbor the week before his disappearance. The neighbor had said something that at the time had seemed merely strange, but now, years later, and in another place, acquired a different weight. He had said that Elias Mercer knew things about people that the people themselves didn't know about themselves, that there was a quality in his attention that made a person feel completely read, completely mapped out, even before they had said anything of importance. Dora held on to that description for a long time after the man left, because it touched on something that previous fragments had circulated without directly naming: The specific nature of what made Elias Mercer effective at what he did wasn't just geographic isolation or the careful selection of victims without close family. It was also that ability to accurately read people, that understanding of how to build